You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. Earlier in the fall, I was really happy to be hosted by TechCrunch Disrupt, the premier startup technology conference in the world, and I hosted a couple panels. One of them was on the importance of commercial space power, especially in the context of the Defense Department. I was happy to have on this panel John Plumb, the first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Mandy Vaughn, the CEO and founder of GXO Inc., and General James Dickinson, the commander of U.S. Space Command. Now, keep in mind this was recorded in September. We meant to come out with it earlier, but the tragedy in the Middle East has focused our content elsewhere, unfortunately, but I'm happy to bring you this important discussion on space power. John, I'd like to start with you. How are you and your colleagues at the Defense Department working to make it easier and more attractive for companies to work with the Defense Department, companies that have important space technology, and what are the hurdles still in the way? I understand you have a new strategy in the works.
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks, Ryan, and thanks to TechCrunch for setting this up. It's great to be part of this event with my friends here. I'll just say from the top, space is absolutely essential for the Department of Defense. It is, we say it's in our DNA. Every single mission, every single day, whether it's peacetime, crisis, or conflict, is using space to help deliver that. Therefore, it's essential for us to be able to move at speed, not something we're always known to do, and more cost effectively, not something we're always known to do. And I think that's where we really see the attractiveness of harnessing commercial space to also be used for the department. Right? Commercial space is an economic driver, it is an innovation driver. And now that space is democratized, it's not just us and Russia and maybe China, right? All sorts of players, people in this room, people watching can be part of the space piece. And the fact that all this innovation is happening, how can we move at speed for that? We think that it really will help us, in particular for resilience purposes. And different mission areas have different advantages that we're looking at. In fact, my office is leading a commercial space integration strategy. That's the first of its kind for the department. And it really just shows how the department is seized with getting after this and getting it right. I will say on hurdles, there's a couple things, and I like to think of them in two different buckets. One is bureaucratic hurdles, and that's kind of what you think about red tape and the different pieces that we could probably solve with some bureaucratic changes. Overclassification problems are one, and just the amount of effort it takes maybe for a commercial company to get through the door. But the other part is sort of a mismatch or a difference between what we need from space and what commercial industry does. Our requirements are not just for peacetime, they're also for conflict. And so if you just think about cybersecurity, we need rigid cybersecurity if we want to be able to rely on a satellite constellation to be there in a conflict when we anticipate it to be attacked in cyber. And that is different than a commercial business model. And so that's the tension we're dealing with.
That's great. It's really interesting, and we'll dig into that a little more. General Dickinson, you're really where the rubber meets the road when it comes to space and military power. And as you face an environment, space has become more congested, contested, and competitive. How are you looking at partnerships with companies in ways that might be different from the way we did things in the past?
Well, very good. Well, first, thanks, Ryan and TechCrunch for having me today. This is an honor for me to be sitting here on the stage with two esteemed colleagues, John Plumb and Mandy. Good to see you. Again, honor to be here, representing 18,000 service members around the world that are doing space command missions. And so as we all think about that through this week, just remember those great servicemen and women that are serving around the world each and every day in some very remote locations that are doing all things space for our great nation. But to your point to your question on commercial integration, commercial partnership for U.S. Space Command is vital to what we do each and every day. There are three areas that I'll touch on very briefly in my opening remarks here. The first is to talk a little bit about three areas that we partner with the commercial industry. One is our commercial integration cell that we have just down the road here, just down the coast at Vandenberg Space Force Base. It's a commercial integration cell that's focused primarily on satellite communications. We started that back in about 2015 with 6 partners at that time. Since then, we've expanded it to 10. And so a very important relationship that we have there, working side by side with these great commercial satellite communication companies. And the interesting thing with that is the information sharing that we do with those companies is vital to space operations. Quite frankly, it allows us to do safe and secure and responsible behaviors in space because we're synchronizing our efforts with them each and every day. That's one. The second one is relatively new, our joint commercial operations cell that we have in Colorado Springs, Colorado, at a place called the Catalyst Campus. This relationship has to do with space domain awareness. So we work very closely with up to now 28 companies that provide that service or those capabilities and capacity, quite frankly, to U.S. Space Command. So this is our ability to leverage the commercial sector to look up and tell us what they can see in the space domain. And as we all can admit in here, space is a pretty big place. Understanding what happens in that domain is critical, not only for what we do in the military, but also in the commercial sector and the civil sector. So as we watch as that domain becomes much more congested over the last few years and continuing to do so as we watch some of these great achievements that are happening both in the military and civil sectors, we're watching how important that is that we pull all of our capabilities together to be able to look up and describe what's happening. This cell out there, I said it has 28 companies right now and growing. We also have great participation by our allies and partners in that particular area. We've got 9 countries right now that are participating with us in that space domain awareness mission set, supported by the commercial industry. And we have 6 more countries that are willing and interested to join the team as well. So as we look to expand that, of course, we're working very closely hand in hand with SSC, Space Systems Command, just down the road in Los Angeles, in terms of helping us bring on commercial partners. It's critical to what we do. Then the third and the final one is an area that we work very closely with all of our allies and partners in academic institutions and commercial as well, is our space situational sharing agreements. So we have over 180 of those right now that we have signed and are working closely with those countries, academic institutions, and allies and partners. And this is a great opportunity for us to share information, look at operations in space, all with the theme of coming back to making sure that we have a safe, secure, and stable space domain environment in which to operate. And so those are areas that we're growing very rapidly. And I just like to highlight, the academic institution part of that, over 180 SSA sharing agreements, 130 of those, a little more than 130 are with commercial partners. But the balance of that are with some of these great commercial countries and our allied partner nations, as well as academic institutions, not only in the United States, but all around the world. So those are 3 areas, Ryan, that we're working very closely with the commercial industry right now.
Looking at your bio, it's just incredible the depth of expertise you have in the space industry. I don't think I've met anyone that has more experience in the space industry. So you're the perfect person to ask this question to. What are you hearing from industry in terms of what the Defense Department is doing, and is it changing enough? Is it changing fast enough? What remains to be done? Is industry happy? Or I know that's a big question, but industry is, of course, not one monolithic thing, but
of course it is, just like the Department of Defense is too, right? But I'll first answer that by saying one note of context that what the General just referenced here from space situational awareness and space domain awareness is one facet. As I'm looking across industry to answer that question, I'm also looking at the combat services and combat support missions that also address the rest of the department. So from that regard, it is one where a lot of work is going on within the department that's changing the rhetoric. They're talking about a much more nuanced approach in terms of what is commercial and how does it integrate into these mission sets. But there's still a pretty fundamental disconnect between what is that rhetoric and what's in the RFP. And what is the addressable chunk of the budget that this sector can actually go after? So when you really kind of look at where is the priority, I think it's one where it's easy to say, okay, if I can look at the budget and I can tell you what the priorities are. And from there, we're just not moving the needle. So I think there's some more fundamental things that we really need to think about in terms of what are institutional changes that we need to make in the department through the entire life cycle of a program to really think about how do we integrate commercial capabilities and these capacities in a more truly integrated fashion. This line of demarcation that commercial is this thing on the side that we'll sometimes use as an augmentation is inherently a limitation. So what we need to try to do is how do we wrestle through finding that impedance match? How do we learn how to trust each other? And part of that trust is a cyber baseline, but how do we practice, train, equip our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and guardians in terms of using these capabilities as part of their everyday mission. So then when there is a crisis, it's already in place. So how do we change our thinking in terms of what is that enduring relationship that we can have this dialogue start now and find that impedance match?
Well, it's a good thing we have the guy leading policy on this sitting right next to you, so maybe you guys can compare notes.
We'll arm wrestle after this, so yeah.
Well, John, what do you think about that?
So I think Mandy makes a lot of good points. I'll just say on that last part about integrating commercial space players, my office just ran a tabletop exercise with quite a few commercial stakeholders. And that is actually one of our takeaways, is that if we're going to use things, we actually need to make sure that we're integrating the operators of the commercial side in to some of our exercises so they understand how we might call on them. So I think it's a really good point. And I take your point on the RFP piece, which I happily have nothing to do with. So I'm happy to notch that one up. But no, there's a lot to do. I think what we were just discussing this before the panel, the department is focused on this. There is interest. There is innovation to be harnessed. But it's not like after this panel, everything's going to be fixed, right? But things are growing. We're writing a strategy. Space Force has got a strategy coming. The department is pushing on this in a lot of ways, and it's going to take a little bit of time, but I do think it's headed in the right direction, if not as fast as some might like.
John Dickinson, when we were speaking on the phone recently, you said something that I thought was really interesting about how you look at layering different commercial capabilities, so you're not necessarily just dependent on one. I know you could say it better than I can, but could you tell the audience about that?
Well, I thought you did pretty good. Huh? The question becomes, do we ever see where we'll be totally commercial or totally military in how we approach, operations in the space domain? And I would tell you, I think it's a balanced and layered approach. I think it's a balance that we just talked about how you bring them into tabletop exercises or operations, and we're doing that every day with the commercial partners I just described, and we're learning a lot. But I think there is no one commercial capability that will sort of hang our hat on. It'll be a balance of commercial capabilities and military capabilities, because I think there'll be some areas where we'll say, hey, that could be predominantly commercial, and I think some areas will look that probably needs to be predominantly military. But striking that balance is, I think, where we're at right now with the new policy coming out at the Department of Defense. We have our own command level commercial integration strategy that we published back in April of 2022. And we had to do that in response of this really, quite frankly, very positive interest in expanding our commercial partners. And quite frankly, we had to figure out how to bring everybody on in a framework that was organized, balanced, and we were able to integrate them and bring them on the team as needed, as they desired. So I do think it's a balanced and it's a layered approach to how we absolutely integrate commercial partners into the team.
Hey, I just want to take this quick break from this discussion to talk about the War on the Rocks membership program, War on the Rocks Platinum. If you haven't checked it out yet, I really recommend you do. There has never been a better time to become a member. Not only do you get the Russia contingency with Michael Kaufman, Thinking the Unthinkable with Ankit Panda, which is about nukes. You get several newsletters, you get the Warcast, you get unspent rounds, you get more and more and more stuff all the time. So if you are someone who works on national security issues, this is really a must-have. And since it's the holiday season, be in the spirit of giving, you can also give the War on the Rocks membership as a gift to the national security professional in your life. So check out warontherocks.com/membership, and thank you for considering it this holiday season. Now back to our conversation about commercial space power. This question is really for all of you. As we've seen this explosion of interest in resourcing in new institutions when it comes to space and the Defense Department, military power, our allies have all sort of followed our lead on that and have made their own exciting investments in space and their own new institutions, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere. And what's going on in Ukraine really illustrates how important these, interoperability is and how these things talk to each other and work together. Maybe John and General Dickinson could speak to how that's going on the government-to-government, military-to-military side. But I'd also like to hear from you, Mandy, is this internationalization also happening in industry as well? And what are the challenges to doing business with different countries when you're a company based in country A and not country B, even if they're an allied country?
Well, from my perspective, again, there's tremendous energy in our allies in terms of being part of the space enterprise, being part of the space team. We have seen, multiple countries around the world stand up their own equivalent to U.S. Space Command, and in terms of their own Space Force as well. And so as we look at that, I think when I first took command, we only had 2 or 3 countries that had formalized their Space Command. And now I think we're up, don't quote me, but you might, probably 8 or 9 now that have that equivalency. And so that's from the military side. They absolutely understand and see the importance of space, not only to their economies, not only to their citizens, but they see how important it is to their military operations and our combined military operations. So there's been just a great, over the last 4 years, understanding, increase of awareness and advocacy on the military side. What I am seeing in these countries as well is because a lot of these countries have their own commercial space industry as part of their economy, and they're seeing how powerful those particular companies are in terms of supporting some of their mission areas and doing their own internal commercial integration processes. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we were talking about the JCO and our SSA sharing agreements. We have seen where there's more than 30 different companies around the world outside of the United States that are willing to be part of that SSA sharing agreement, space situational awareness sharing agreements that I mentioned earlier. So to me, that's powerful. That is a powerful advantage that we as a whole, we as the United States as well as around the world, are pulling this together. And we've seen this in other domains in terms of how powerful it is, the commercial and the allies and partners are to our collective mission success.
So you said interoperability, Ryan, and I think when I hear that word, I feel like that's a pretty high bar. There's also just coordinated effects or coordinated operations, which is a lesser included thing, but can be just as effective in a lot of pieces. So you might want to have interoperable SATCOM so you can talk to each other through the same constellation, but you might not need that for other particular mission areas. But I would say that it's a thing we're all trying to get after, and it is hard because space is weirdly new in this arena. I mean, we do alliance operations or coordinated operations with other countries, multinational task force, for air, for land, for sea, no problem. Space is harder. One of the reasons it's harder is the classification problem, which kind of just keeps rearing its head, which is if I can't talk to you at the classification level of the data, then that's really hard to do this type of thing. So we're working on it. We're working on it at CSPO as well. So not just bilaterally with different allies, where sometimes those solutions are easier, but to do a multilateral piece, the Combined Space Operations Group that both General Dickinson and I are part of.
So I'll add just a little bit of color and some food for thought here as we kind of look at what the future may hold too. But one thing to kind of think through with current events and some of the lessons learned with Ukraine is really also that between the communications architecture as well as a lot of the ISR, the GeoInt, the pictures that you're seeing about Ukraine, a lot of these relationships with commercial operators, this was all born out of crisis. So there were some arrangements, but for the most part, it's like, okay, we've got a huge issue. Now what are we going to do about it? A couple of things we need to think about is as we're looking at what is kind of over the next 10 years, what could be that run up to crisis, it probably won't be this as clear of a line of demarcation as it was with Ukraine, right? We already see it in the cyber domain, that there's contested, congested space operations. Things are going to be always a little bit gray, a little bit uncertain, a little bit hard to attribute and maybe understand, and a little bit escalatory. So how do we respond with those kinds of technical surprises if it's a much more gray kind of conflict that we're trying to deal with? So I think that's one thing that goes back to my earlier point on kind of this line of demarcation with commercial, that again, we need to have that enduring relationship now to practice and figure out how do we trust each other. So if we're confronted with a scenario that is a lot more gray and confusing, we're already on the same page. And I think another thing that we really need to think about as a community is in all of these circumstances, we tend to hear the government folks talk about commercial as unclassified, right? And that certainly is the case. Maxar's data is on the front page of the Washington Post because it is an unclassified picture, what have you. But does the entire nature of the relationship have to be that way? And then what is the information and what do we gain from that aggregate picture back to you in your command centers to have a better understanding of what is probably ground truth, right? So I think there's a more nuanced way that we need to think about how does this information sharing really go. And to confound the problem is we're all in the theater together, right? Whether it's a DoD satellite or an NRO satellite or a commercial satellite, we're all in the theater together. We're all experiencing the effects together. We all have to cooperate, whether we're in the conflict or not. So it's a very different discussion about our own roles as this community that I think we need to think through for what I think will be a much more muddled kind of next 10 years in terms of what's happening, whether it's cooperative or not.
I think it's interesting you said that about unclassified or not. The flip side of that is if it's unclassified, then we don't have any of those information sharing problems, which is why you see it on the Washington Post, which is why that. So there's a tension there as well that we haven't kind of wrestled through, which is some things can be classified, but the more we can do or share at the unclassified level, the less bureaucratic overhead there is to get in the way.
Good point.
Mandy, some space companies are already very important and powerful actors on the world stage in their own right. And the example that's front of mind for everyone is, of course, SpaceX and recent news about Starlink access in support of a Ukrainian attack that was planning to go into Crimea. And apparently Elon Musk did not agree for that coverage to be extended. But also he's provided Starlink access to the Ukrainian armed forces for their own targeting in their own territory, although Crimea is still a part of Ukraine. But not to get too far into that. But I don't want you to speak to that example, but I think it's a really good example of a larger phenomenon that's increasingly going to become perhaps problematic, is private companies having such immense power over things that used to be the territory of governments almost exclusively. And how is industry thinking about this? How are you thinking about this? How do you think government should be thinking about this?
I think it goes back to the earlier point too, just on what is that point of demarcation and what is the relationship that you have with the providers now, when you don't need it, when it's not a conflict. Again, part of where I think we ran into a problem with Ukraine was because it was born out of crisis. Everyone on both sides was trying to figure out, what do I do with this? And there was no control that the department could exert. So if we have a contractual relationship now, and then maybe with other providers, so it's not that we only have one solution that we can bring to bear, then we're playing into exactly the point of resiliency, that a hybrid architecture is inherently more resilient. If you have the access to every commercial provider at that time of need, then it wouldn't be such a profound impact if there's one weird problem. Again, I think it just goes back to that level of trust and practice. So how do we think through what would the department have needed to have in place first to where you could have compelled them to be part of the team? And let's think through that.
Without looking at that specific instance, but that general point is really what we're looking at with our commercial space integration strategy is, like I said at the top, if the department is interested in commercial space, it's not just for peacetime. And so is there a contractual mechanism, for example, that we can then rely on it being available to us in a crisis or conflict is a really important part of this. And again, this is new and is being partially born out of the Ukraine situation.
And I would just add on that I agree. We have to have that relationship well before we get to a point like we saw in Ukraine and Russia. So that building of confidence, building of trust, understanding, what capabilities that can be provided and how those are integrated into our concept of operations and our daily operations is critical.
Great. Well, my last question, and we're at Disrupt. From each of your own perspectives, to the founders in the room, prospective founders, why should they be building space companies that seek to work with the Defense Department?
I think space is pretty exciting. And I think everybody in this room and probably watching believes that as well, not only from a military perspective, but certainly from a commercial and civil perspective. I get excited when we talk about Artemis going back to the moon and beyond. U.S. Space Command actually have some actions, some missions that we do to support NASA and other civil organizations as well. And so I think, we should be excited because space is not the next frontier. I think we're already there. It's exciting to be part of that. It's exciting to be the commander of U.S. Space Command during this period of time. And I think nothing but optimism in terms of what we're seeing in the future.
I think it's really kind of the motivation in terms of not just tech for tech's sake, but it is a clear example of how can you create a mission that matters? How do you do something that either goes in or through or enabled by space that really can profoundly impact the planet? Whether it's something from just economic tools, climate change, climate awareness, or actually being able to take that picture that can go onto the Washington Post. These are all things that really link humanity in a way that's very, very different. And to be able to start a company that can play in that sector, but then have a relationship on the government side to where you can understand how can you increase the effectivity of what that is pretty powerful. I think my challenge to the panelists here is how do we really broaden that aperture and bring more of that kind of ecosystem into the fold, because it's one, I think we all know, it's like, how well can we really learn from each other to just really accelerate that pace of changes is quite impressive.
So let me just give you a personal kind of vignette, which is that during President Obama's administration, I worked in the space policy office as the acting DASD for a little while. And so that was about 12 years ago, 10 years ago, and it was a stovepipe. Nobody paid much attention to it. They did good work. We produced some great generals out of it, but it was a small little group that kind of did its own thing. This is 10 years later. People cannot get enough of space. The department cannot get enough of space. The Congress created my position because of the recognition that space is now so important to national security and to national defense. And that message has now spread through the department. And so what that means is the department now understands at the highest echelons and down to the lower echelons that space is essential. And I think that opens up this opportunity for more commercial integration that simply didn't exist before because the realization wasn't there and perhaps the necessity wasn't there. So we are a little bit slower. Our budget processes are slower, but this is building and the understanding is there. And so I would say, yes, it is worth working with us and please give us a shot. Yeah.
And John, you're a Navy veteran, right?
I am.
How does Space Force feel about a Navy guy having this job?
It's all one team, one fight, right? One team, one fight.
Thank you for listening to the War on the Rocks podcast. Please check out our membership program at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.